Good evening. So tonight we're going to talk about things you can't see. I was just downstairs at the museum looking at all electricity and magnets and things like this. We're going to talk about microbes. So you can see the title, Let Them Eat Dirt, and we'll get into that in a second. And I've worked on diarrhea all my life, so I have a very perverse sense of humor, so this is why this is restricted for fecal content. And I do want to say thank you for CFAR, Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. They sponsor a program I'm involved with on human and microbes, and they're co-sponsoring this lecture. Okay, what do you see? A cute baby, right? So by the time we're done this lecture, I want you to see that kid looking more like this, coated in microbes. And that's really going to be what the talk is about kids and microbes and then how that actually affects these children and they develop. But to do that, I'm going to tell you, we're going to go way back in history, and we're going to tell the story of how we got to where we are today and what we now are realizing that's really changing our whole views of the microbial world. So I want to go way back to late 1683. This is Anthony van Leeuwenhoek. He's a Dutchman, and he makes linens for trade, and he loved to look at his linens. So he ground magnifying glasses to see the weave and the colors and everything. And he was really good at grinding lenses, and he got so good, he actually made the very first microscope. And what do you do when you make a microscope? You look at things, right? So he went out and he picked up some rainwater and saw these neat things in there and everything. But then he did the most amazing experiment. He basically said, I wonder what's in my mouth. I don't know why you'd ever think that, but he ground out his mouth, put it up, held his little microscope up there top, and lo and behold, it was full of these wiggly things. He called them animalcules, which are, of course, the microbes that are in his mouth. No one had ever seen these things before. And he made this stunning statement that there's many of these things living in my mouth than all the people that live in the Netherlands, which is where he lived at that time. And that's when microbiology was discovered. Of course, everyone thought he was nuts. No one believed him. Members kept writing the Royal Society here, and they kept sort of throwing him in a bin of the crazy bin kind of thing. And then they started to say, well, maybe there's something there. They actually sent people to his lab to look at these things, and lo and behold, it was true. There were microbes there. So that's late 1680s kind of thing. And you're probably not microbiologists, but I want to emphasize this. We live in a microbial world. The air you breathe, this earth did not have air. I didn't have oxygen when it was first formed. Microbes made that oxygen, allowing us to then breathe that air. And when you put the tree of life up, the animals and plants you can see are just two of those tiny little branches there. The rest of the branches of life, they're all microbes. You can't see them, but they're the foundation of life on our earth. And we've all come from microbes. That's how we evolved. So it's really important to remember that there's all these microbes there just because you can't see them. Okay, on our historical journey, let's fast forward to the late 1800s. These two gentlemen, very famous gentlemen, Robert Koch, a German, and Louis Pasteur, a Frenchman. They hated each other, right? Just because they were competitors and maybe nationalities, who knows. But anyways, what these gentlemen did in their labs is they showed that microbes could cause disease. And that was a stunning turn of events because no one knew why you got sick. There was bad air and there's all sorts of hypotheses, but no one really knew. And what these guys showed is that things like cholera and tuberculosis and other diseases like that were caused by microbes. And what Louis Pasteur also showed, if you basically killed these things by heat, pasteurization, you could then block these microbes from communicating disease. And that was a profound thing because now, okay, if microbes are bad, if we kill the bad microbes, that's better, right? So society started this major campaign to clean up our world. We brought in sanitation, we brought in antibiotics were discovered. These were wonder drugs. That's science from the World War II. You could actually cure gonorrhea now. Previously, you couldn't with these antibiotics. And we invented vaccines, and we got the hygiene together and everything. And we got really good at killing these microbes. And now you can get, for example, hand sanitizer now. Kills 99.9% of bacteria. That's great, right? We can get rid of these things. Kids in the 1930s, they had like 30%, 40% death rates under the age of 1. Now it's less than 0.1%. People live longer because of this. So that sort of led to the concept that this hygiene really works. This is a list of many infectious diseases that we knew for the past 50 years. And every one of these things in the past 50 years has gone like this, right? That's terrific. I mean, when's the last time you saw a case of rheumatic fever? You never see it anymore. Hepatitis A. Even TB, we hear about it, but the amount of TB actually is still fairly low. Measles and mumps, I guess when I was a kid, I remember getting measles, mumps, terrible diseases. Kids don't get those things anymore. So that's good, right? We've really improved the world. But now the plot gets thicker. Let's have a look at the second half of this. On the right-hand side of those curves is the same 50 years. There's asthma, obesity, diabetes, autism, inflammatory bowel disease. Think of the diseases that we see in our society today. They're very different diseases than when we had infectious diseases. And the question is, what is doing this? Why have we changed? That's 50 years. We've gone through what? Maybe 2 generations, 25 years of generation maybe? We haven't genetically changed. Something has changed in our world. And this has led to what we call the hygiene hypothesis. And really that's the tenet of this talk tonight, is that we're actually living too clean, and we're depriving our bodies of microbes that we usually get. And this is having big consequences. Okay, when I look out at the audience, I see a bunch of people, right? You look around, what do you see? You see people, right? Wrong. What you're actually seeing is these people that are coated in microbes. There's at least as many microbes in and on you as there are human cells. There's 15 times more genetic material from these microbes on you than there is Homo sapiens DNA. So my students get really ticked off when I call them more microbe than human. So there's a lot of them there. And the question is, well, how do we know that? Well, it turns out that, you'll recall, 10, 15 years ago, there was a massive effort to sequence the human genome. And they made all these gene sequencers, and they lined them up, and they sequenced the human genome. That was terrific. We had the human genome sequence. But then these sequencers realized that, well, what are we going to sequence next? Because otherwise, we're kind of out of a job, right? Someone had a bright idea. Let's sequence microbes. There's lots of them. So then they formed something called the Human Microbiome Project to sequence the microbes on us. Because most of the microbes in and on you, if you just stick them out on a plate, they won't grow. The reason Escherichia is so famous is because Dr. Escherichia was his name, happened to streak his feces out on a plate way back in the 1800s, and that microbe that actually grew because it could tolerate air, we now know as Escherichia coli or E. coli. And most of the others die in the plate. So you can't grow them, but you can sequence them. And so by doing that, you can actually get a catalog of what the microbes are in and on us. And what we're learning is something really amazing. We are all different. Every one of us has different microbes than each other. And the numbers are stupendous. There's 100 trillion microbes in and on you. That's a big number, right? What does it mean? Well, I told you we'd talk about feces. Let's pretend the tip of your little finger weighs about 1 gram is a little piece of feces. There are more microbes in that than there are people living in this entire world. So think of that the next time you go to the washroom, what you've just done, mass murderer, going down the tube. There's lots of microbes there. And they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. They're what we call gram-positive and gram-negatives. Some can tolerate air, some can't. And being a scientist, I like to do geek experiments. This is actually an experiment I really did. That cell on the left. I was bored one night in the lab, so I went and brushed my teeth really well. Then I did the Anthony van Leeuwenhoek experiment. I swabbed out that cheek cell, put it on a slide, and then stained it. And what do you see? Well, first of all, you see a beautiful cell with a gorgeous nucleus. That's me. But then you see all those other little dots on there. Those are microbes. Those are the microbes in my mouth. They live there. That's normal. And you could all do the same experiment. You see the same thing. So they're there. They're all over us. And, we live with them, and that's normal for us. So where are they in the body? They're basically everywhere your body is exposed to the environment. So they're in your mouth, the oral, we've talked about that. They're in the nasal cavity, because every time you breathe air, you filter out microbes. They're on your skin. But skin's different. The skin on the palm of your hand, or on the back of your arm, for example, is very different than your armpit. Your armpit's moist, right? So the microbes are different there than they're different here. The microbes are even different on your right hand and your left hand. What does your right hand do and your left hand do? Watch them for a bit. They do different things. You scratch with one hand, you hold a pointer with another. They actually have different things, and we can actually see differences between right and left hands because they're kind of different environments. So that's the skin. Urinary tract, especially women, vaginal tract, there's a large amount of microbes there, and they actually do a lot of good by preventing urinary tract infections and things. Where most of the microbes are is As you go down the intestine, they get more and more and more. And when you get down to the very low bottom of the intestine, there's no air there, but it's packed with a microbial paste. That's where most of them live. Okay, that's normal. We have microbes. What happens over our life? Well, when you're born, you acquire your microbes, and we'll talk about this in a moment. And then you kind of bounce around as a little baby. Then you get sort of childhood microbes. Then you become an adult. And your microbes remain pretty much constant for your whole adult life, unless you do something drastic like move to a different country or become a vegetarian or change your diet. And that's pretty much constant over your adult life. That's you, that's your microbes, that's normal. And then once you turn 65 or so, your microbes just fall off a cliff. And we don't understand this yet, but elder people, their microbes are very different. But most of your adult life, it's constant unless you say take antibiotics. Okay, so that's how we acquire them, and over our lifetime, the question comes, do we need these things to live? And the answer is yes, you actually do. So that experiment's been done a couple of ways. There was this boy who before he was born, they realized he had no immune system. That means that he would die as soon as he was born. He'd die of infections because you need the immune system to fight off infections. So they birthed him sterilely by cesarean section. They put him in a sterile container, and they fed him sterile human food and water. But what you have to realize is these microbes make certain vitamins that without them, you die. But they knew that, so they gave him these vitamins. And he actually lived 12 years in this isolated container. He became known as the bubble boy before he died of infection at 12. So they got him to live, but it was not a normal life. And we now know there's many things wrong with organisms that are born without microbes. You can do the same kind of experiment in animals, birth them by C-section, and we keep them in a sterile cage. We call these germ-free animals. They should really be called microbe-free. You feed them sterile food and water. And we've learned all sorts of things, if you do that to these things and give them the right vitamins, that their gut doesn't develop normally. Their immune system does not develop normally. Even their brains don't develop normally. These are not normal physiological organisms. They need these microbes to develop normally. Okay, so you need them for life. What about disease? And this is where it gets really interesting. So up here is a list of a few, but not all the diseases, that have been shown to have differences in the microbes in and on you. And you can see some of these diseases, colon cancer, diabetes, obesity, rheumatoid arthritis. None of those diseases you would think would be associated with microbes. But we know people with these diseases, they actually have a different kind of microbiota. We call this dysbiosis. It's unbalanced. That doesn't mean that's causing it, because for example, if you have inflammatory bowel disease, your gut's on fire, that probably is screwing the microbes, skewing them differently anyway. But these are smoking guns, and I'll say more as we go along in this talk about how some of these the microbes might actually be contributing to these diseases. So there's a lot of excitement at this, saying that, wow, microbes are different in diseased people. Maybe that's trying to tell us something. Even more exciting is you can do something about it. That takes me to my favorite slide here, fecal transfers. Don't try calling this number, it's a joke. But you've probably heard of fecal transfers. There's this disease called by Clostridium difficile. It's a nasty germ that causes disease. If you're going to the hospital, say for hip surgery, the surgeons fill you up with antibiotics so you don't get an infection where the surgery is. That's good for avoiding infections. But what those antibiotics do is they carpet bomb the microbes in and on you, and they just have drastic effect on these microbes. And it wipes them all out, so then C. diff, or Clostridium difficile, can then come crawling in, and it can cause an infection. And this is a life-threatening infection. It's killed many people because of it. How do you treat this infection? The antibiotics caused it, so when you try and treat with antibiotics, you only cure about 20%. If you do a fecal transfer, which is exactly as it sounds, you take feces from a healthy person and either put it down through a tube or up via enema into this person will live 96% of the time. Amazing. So a life-threatening disease. I know it's gross, but if your option is to die, take the fecal transfer, honestly. So this created huge excitement because that says we can actually change the microbes now. And we can't change our genes. We still can't do gene therapy in people yet, but we can change microbes. So that's where some more of this excitement is starting to come along. Okay, so this talk is a little about early in life, and let's spend a little time talking about that. When you're born, the best birthday present your mother ever gives you is your very first one. It's a bolus of fecal and vaginal microbes. It's not something you want to put in a package, but that's a really important event for us because that kickstarts the whole body's immune system and basically the body gets going. And if you don't have that event, if you're born by cesarean section, for example, that doesn't happen, and that has consequences. So as soon as the kid's born, they start having these microbes. And for any of you that have kids or babysit, you know that the microbes, if they're being breastfed, it's nice, sweet-smelling poo kind of thing. It's not bad. Lord help you when you introduce solid foods, you know what happens at the other end. You then have to change the diapers. You know something major has happened, right? That's been the shift in the microbes as you go to solid food. It bounces around a bit. About 2 years, it kind of stabilizes, and that's sort of the toddler thing. So in those 2 years of life, there's major events happening in how the body actually develops. And one of those events is the immune system. And we've alluded to this. This is the system that fights off infections and basically keeps our body healthy. And this is T cells, B cells, antibodies, all those things you've heard about. So I'm going to tell you one story about how microbes affect the immune system, and that has to do with asthma. So asthma is basically an inflammation of the lungs. You have trouble breathing. So you take these inhalers which have anti-inflammatories called steroids to try and dampen the inflammation to breathe. When I was a kid, we had one kid in our school that had asthma. So he had this thing in him. You had to be a mutant because no one else did it now. You know? Now if you go to the playground, kid takes a puff from the puffer, runs up the slide, passes the puffer to his friend who takes a puff, and they sort of pass it down the line, right? 25% of kids have asthma now. That's amazing. What has changed? Well, asthma is one of those developed country diseases I was alluding to. It was one of those curves that we saw rising up. This is seen, the highest levels of asthma are seen in what we call developed countries. Canada, the US, you can see the UK up there. Scotland actually has the highest incidence in this particular curve. There's Australia there. What's going on in these countries? And there's all sorts of theories why. When you look at, say, Africa, for example, there's basically no asthma. They have infectious disease and the kids die young, yes, but they don't have asthma. So let's start looking at some clues. If you live on a farm, you have a 20% less rate of asthma than if you live in the city. I love this picture. Can you imagine being a kid riding a chicken? I mean, yeehaw, right? Okay, so farm does this. We've alluded to this a bit. If you're born by cesarean section, if you're born by C-section, just the fact by how you enter this world changes your risk of asthma, increases it by 20%. Asthma doesn't happen until age 5, yet we know that simple event does it. If you have antibiotics early in life, you have a higher rate of asthma than if you don't get antibiotics. And finally, if you're breastfed, you have much lower rates of asthma. So what do all these things have in common? Microbes, right? So the way I got into this, so I, for all my life, have studied bacteria-caused diarrhea. I wasn't kidding. That's been my mainstay for my life. And my wife's a pediatrician, and I came home one night, and we've been using antibiotics to shift microbes in the lab animals to give them different rates of diarrhea. And I was all excited about this. I said, hey, Jane, giving these mice antibiotics really has effects on the diarrhea. And she says, Brett, kids that get antibiotics in the first year of life have increased asthma. I said, that's interesting. And, being the good husband, I didn't believe her, so I go to the library, I look it up. Guys, we know, wives are always right. She, of course, was right. Since then, there's been many studies coming out showing that antibiotics cause this. But then I got curious, and I said, okay, so where's the data? Can we find an experiment that actually shows that these microbes are affecting this? And we couldn't. There was just correlation. So then I convinced a grad student, Shannon Russell, in the lab, just to do some experiments in mice. Let's just treat them with antibiotics and see if we can change asthma rates. Simple experiment, because the guy at our university had the most asthma model already going. I said, just treat them with antibiotics, see what happens. And lo and behold, if you treated really young mice while they're still breastfeeding with antibiotics, you jacked up the asthma rates off the charts. They'd never seen asthma rates like this in at all. The other thing to remember is if we did it in adult mice, there was no effect. Didn't change asthma rates. So early life antibiotics seem to have an effect on it. So that was interesting. We pursued that for a while. But that was mice. What about kids? Well, we then did a big study in children, in Canadian children, and we looked at microbes at 3 months of age and 1 year of age. So think of a 3-month-old baby, really tiny baby, right? They're not really doing much at 3 months of age. At 1 year, they're still a kid. And the reason we chose those ages is they kind of coincided, the 3-month-old with the age of the mice that we saw that effect. We did this big study, and we looked at the microbes in these kids, and what we found is that in the feces of 3-month-old kids, we could pick out 4 microbes that if you had those microbes, you were at very low risk for asthma. If you didn't have those microbes, you were at very high risk. So these 4 microbes are basically protective. 1 year of age, it's too late by then. It's really early in life. So you can see where that's going now. We're starting to think, well, can we actually give these microbes to kids that are missing them? Can we actually prevent asthma, et cetera? So it's very exciting. We certainly don't have all the answers yet. But the reason I think we see this is from our mouse studies, we know that they're basically affecting how the immune system develops. It pushes you to an allergic immune system if you lack those microbes, or if you have those 4 microbes, it pushes you to sort of a protective normal immune system. The other experiment we did is we took kids' feces from a 3-month-old that lacked those things. That kid went on to get asthma. It was in the freezer. We then put those 4 microbes into that human feces that was lacking those microbes and put it into a germ-free and microbe-free mouse and then tested it for asthma. And in that mouse model of asthma, if those 4 microbes are there, you protect against mouse asthma. So we're really excited about that because it seems to be that these 4 microbes have this protective thing. So that's one example of how you can imagine these microbes are affecting early life. Another example that we hear a lot about is obesity. We've known adult obesity has been a problem for a while. Now it's becoming a major, major problem in kids. Childhood obesity is a huge problem now. Some of this work got started by a guy named Jeff Gordon in St. Louis, who did a rather simple but fascinating experiment. He took feces from a fat mouse and put it into a thin mouse. It got fat. You can do it the other way around. Take thin mouse feces into fat mouse. It got thin. He then took 2 human twins, one was fat, the one was thin, and put their feces into mice. And lo and behold, the mice that got the fat person's feces got fat. The person that got thin person's feces did not get fat, just by simply transferring the microbes. So that should tell you the microbes are heavily involved in weight type things. And this has become a fascinating area. We certainly haven't solved everything, but one of our CFAR members, Iran Aronov, has basically done some really neat experiments to show that the microbes are heavily involved in this weight gain. He did these experiments where he made these people wear glucose monitors. So spikes in glucose in your blood basically predispose you towards obesity and then diabetes. So you don't want glucose spikes. And then he measured all these foods that these people ate, and he characterized their microbes. And based on that, he built a big bioinformatic platform where he could then start to predict what microbes you had, and what food you ate will tell you whether you get glucose spikes or not. This is basically a personalized diet. So what he's now shown is that, lo and behold, he can actually predict what foods you can eat will give you glucose spikes. Some people can eat ice cream just fine, can't eat pizza. Other way around for other people, because each of you has different microbes in there, and that's going to give you these different glucose spikes. More excitingly is when you start putting people on these personalized diets based on your microbe. It just blows away the classical diets like Weight Watchers, et cetera. So you can see where this is going. There's going to be personalized diets in the future based on the microbes you have, and you can eat this, but you really should stay away from that because that's going to cause problems. This isn't. So it's still a new area, but I think it's an extremely exciting area for weight control and what we might actually do towards the obesity. Inflammatory bowel diseases. So that's Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. These are really nasty, terrible intestinal inflammation problems. Your gut is basically on fire and it has these problems. We've always known microbes are somehow associated with this because they, microbes are in our gut. But it's been a bit of a chicken and egg mystery because we don't know if, because your gut's inflamed, you have different microbes, or you have certain microbes in there that are basically breaking through the cell wall and causing the inflammation. And this is another area where they're starting to do a lot of fecal transfers. And and finding some very interesting results. They actually had some spectacular successes and spectacular failures by doing fecal transfers for people with IBD, especially Crohn's. And what they're finding is that it really depends on the donor. And some people, there was a paper I just read where donor A, they were doing it, didn't work. They then brought in donor B for whatever reason, and donor B, they had the magic juice. And people that got donor B's feces, it fixed inflammatory bowel diseases. That, to me, says there's real hope in the future for this if we can figure out what donor B had that donor A hadn't, right? Now, only about 1 in 5 or so fecal transfers actually work in this field, compared to C. diff, where it always works. But that makes sense, because your gut's already on fire. It's kind of asking the microbes to come in, put out the fire, displace all the nasty ones, dampen the inflammation, reset things, and then colonize and make it work again. That's a much bigger ask than in C. diff, we're pretty much putting in any microbes and they outcompeted. So I think we're going to see some really exciting stuff in this area. So the one thing, so in terms of fecal transfers, I don't know why I'm obsessing on this, but they so far are basically safe, as long as you screen for infectious agents that we know of anyway, like HIV and hepatitis. But the one adverse event that's ever been reported with a fecal transfer is there was a set of twins, twin sisters, one who was obese and healthy, one who was thin, had inflammatory bowel disease. They took the obese, healthy feces, put it in the thin IBD patient, she got better. Great. Problem is, she also got fat. Bad. So now she's suing the other sister for the weight gain issues. That's the only adverse event reported so far. But we still worry, are there microbes in there we don't know about? So where this field is starting to go is the idea that maybe we can actually find out what are good microbes. Let's grow them up in the lab, put them into nice gelatin-coated, cherry-flavored tablet instead of a feces kind of mush. And so you can then just sort of swallow this thing. And there's a woman in Guelph, Ontario in Canada that's been doing this, and she's actually done it in 2 patients for C. difficile. It worked, cured them nicely with these lab-grown microbes. That's great. Then she called it repopulate, which I thought was a perfect way of looking at it. Okay, as I alluded to, I work on diarrhea. I jokingly call it our bread and butter. We can find amazing differences in susceptibility to diarrhea depending on the microbes. Now, you've all probably been, I don't know, to a wedding or something, and there's contaminated potato salad, and 100 people eat it, but 20 get sick and 80 don't. Did you ever wonder why? Probably not, but I would. So what we now know is that it really depends on the microbes. And you can actually, just like these other things, you can do fecal transfers, and you can take mice that would always die of a diarrheal disease, and you can put their feces into mice that don't die. They then get much sicker, and similarly, mice that are protected, going to a susceptible mouse, it will protect it. So that's an area that our lab's very active involved in, is can we find microbes that actually basically decrease the diarrheal load. Probably the most fascinating area, I think, in this whole field is the gut-brain axis, the effect of the microbes on the brain. No, I'm not crazy. We're actually starting to see this. So you know the brain controls the gut. It basically controls your motility, et cetera, et cetera. But what we didn't realize is that things in the gut actually affect the brain. We'll talk about anxiety, depression, and stress in a moment, but in this case, I'm talking about autism and ADHD, big problems, a developed country disease. Anytime you hear a disease is associated with the developed world, you should think microbes, because more often than not, there seems to be some linkage there. So like these other things, they are doing fecal transfers in autism. There are some successes and some failures. It's still a very difficult area to work in, but we're starting to realize that these microbes actually affect how the brain works. They can make precursors to neurotransmitters, which is how our brain talks to each other. They can affect the nerves that are going to the brain, affecting brain things. And there's all sorts of fascinating studies coming out about brain and behavior being controlled by microbes. So it's a really new area, but stay tuned. Okay, here's something you probably always wonder. Why do we have body odor? And what causes it? So your body odor doesn't smell. Honest, we can take everyone's body odor, it doesn't smell. It's the microbes living in your armpits. They make these stinking molecules, and that's actually what makes you smell. And so when you're adding deodorants, for example, you're trying to kill the microbes that are causing these odorants. Same as bad breath. halitosis. You don't have bad breath. Your microbes do. And so it's the microbes living on your mouth that make these molecules that actually makes your breath smell. So if you take these antibacterial mouthwashes, for example, you gargle away, you kill many of your microbes, that may or may not work, because what it does is it clears out all the microbes, and if good microbes come in, you're going to smell nice. If bad microbes come in, you're going to have bad breath. But it forces you to rethink all these things because, traditionally, we just thought that person stinks because, I don't know, maybe they have stinky genes or something. But no, it's the microbes that are actually doing it. Okay, here's a truly morbid slide. Here's the 10 reasons why you're going to die, the top 10 reasons. Not that you want to think about this a lot. But when you look at this list, okay, these are all the diseases we see in our world, right? You know these as causing disease. When you look to that list, how many of these things are microbial? When you look down the list, number 8, influenza and pneumonia. So influenza is caused by a virus, flu virus, and then pneumonia is a secondary complication caused by Streptococcus pneumoniae. That's what gives you pneumonia. That's bacterial. That makes sense. What about the others? 9 of those 10 diseases now have microbial links. And the only one that I've been unable to say is have microbes or accidents. So you can't say the microbes made me do it. You can't use that excuse yet. But all these other diseases, there are microbial links, and they're getting stronger and stronger as this field goes along. So let's take 2 of these, heart attacks and strokes, 2 of the top 5 reasons to die. What causes heart attacks and strokes? This is atherosclerosis, right? The hardening of the arteries that you hear about. And everyone says, yeah, that's because you eat a lot of meat and fatty foods and everything. Well, it turns out that microbes play a central role in this. When you eat red meat, there's components of red meat called phosphocholine that microbes actually break down into a molecule, and then your body modifies that into another molecule, and that's the molecule, it's called TMAO, that actually causes atherosclerosis. So if you take germ-free mice, they have no microbes, feed them all this stuff, they never get atherosclerosis because they don't have the microbes to do the first step. If you take vegans and vegetarians, for example, they have much lower rates of these diseases because they don't eat the red meat that does this thing. Probably the most exciting science that's coming along is, in mice anyway, if you block the microbial enzymes at the first part of that step, you block it, they don't get atherosclerosis. So you can think, heart attacks and strokes, in theory, we'd be taking drugs that would drug the microbes so you don't get heart attacks and strokes. It's not there yet, but it's coming within the next few years. And probably the most fun experiment of this whole field that I've been able to find is they convinced a vegan to eat a steak. This person has never eaten a steak in their life. I have no idea how much they paid him. But anyway, they got this person to eat a steak, and they looked what happens to those molecules. The answer was nothing. That makes sense because this person has never eaten a steak, so they don't have the steak breaking down microbes in them, right? Now, if that person kept eating steaks, my guess is it would change. But it made sense, right? So there's 2 reasons why, the microbes seem to be critically involved in that. Another area that's not on the slide is cancer chemotherapy. There's some amazing studies coming out now about responses to chemotherapy. You all hear about people that undergo chemo, and it works for some and doesn't work for others. There's now certain times that chemo, it's called PD-1 inhibitors, that basically the microbes change these things and they allow the chemotherapy to work. And they now are actually looking at people's microbes and say, we can't put you on this chemotherapy because you don't have the right microbes. It's just not going to work. Or you do have the right microbes and it's going to work. And that's just changing chemotherapy, just again by the microbes. Okay, let's return to the brain a bit because I think this is an area that's really of neat interest. So if you take a stressed, an anxious, or a depressed mouse, don't ask me how you do that, but I can tell you later. Trust me, there's ways. And do a fecal transfer into a normal mouse. That normal mouse will be stressed, anxious, or depressed, simply by doing a fecal transfer. Wow, hey? So that's been shown extensively in the field, and everyone knows this is true. For example, also if a mother, when she gives birth, if she's depressed, that actually is transmitted to the kid, potentially by the microbes. There was a great big study done here in the UK which looked at the use of antibiotics in people. You guys have a nice public healthcare system, so they can look at millions of people over the last decades that have ever used antibiotics. And what they showed is that it was a direct correlation, number of courses of antibiotics for increases amount of anxiety and depression. If you have antiviral or antifungal, which are different than antimicrobial, like antibacterial, there was no effect. So just the fact of taking antibiotics, which obviously affect your microbes, has any effect. We've talked about autism and things. Now, another really, I don't know how to apply this yet, but I'd love to, area is jet lag. So there's this Israeli researcher, Iran. He's the same guy that did the diet. He's part of our CFAR group. He's an amazingly creative individual. What he did is he took his grad students and he picked meetings on the exact opposite side of the earth from Israel, over in North America. He said, I'll fly you business class. You go to that meeting and take a sample of your poop and come home. And we're going to see about jet lag. And what he showed is that microbes actually influence the circadian rhythm. And there's been now numerous papers coming out about jet lag. So for those of us that come for a couple of days to the UK, I'm dying for the pills that I can actually take. I'll even take fecal transfer for this. But they influence circadian rhythm. That's our body's rhythms. That's profound. Now, some of it has to do with diet and that, change the hours you eat. If you're eating in the middle of the night, that's very different than in the day. That affects them. But it's another really exciting area. And of course, jet lag is associated with the brain. While we're on the brain, I guess we should deal with this a bit. It's depressing, but a major issue is Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and dementia. So Alzheimer's is basically advanced dementia. But there's some really hopeful things coming out in this very depressing type subject. There's a thing called the MIND diet. It's basically a modified Mediterranean diet. It's not so bad. You can have a glass of red wine a day. If you follow that diet, just by strictly adhering to that diet, you can decrease your Alzheimer's rates by 50%. That's just stunning, just by changing your diet. Even if you say, well, I'm going to have a beer or two, I'm going to deviate slightly, if you partially adhere to it, you can drop it by 15 to 30% just by doing this thing. So that's telling you something. If your diet can change the rates of this, that's arguing there's some kind of microbes involved in this. And yes, this is a Western disease. We see it in all the developed countries. And like all those other diseases I showed you, it's increasing in our society. Ironically, the lowest levels of Alzheimer's are in rural India, which is not a developed country. And, urban rates, you can see the numbers there, tenfold greater in urban places than in rural areas. Why is that? That's probably microbes. And here's a little tidbit I learned. Turns out, brush your teeth. Brush your teeth 3 times a day. And if you do that, this study says that you can decrease your Alzheimer's by like 30%. Just by brushing your teeth 3 times a day. If you floss, it had no effect. And they did a twin study where they took some twins with healthy oral health and the other twin with poor, direct correlation. Good oral health decreases dementia very significantly. Why is that? Well, it turns out that if you have poor oral health, your microbes in your rotting gums seep into your body. This pisses your body off, it becomes inflamed, and it's this chronic inflammation from all this stuff seeping into your body that is really a major risk factor for dementia and Alzheimer's. So if you remember anything from this talk, just go home and brush your teeth and say, thank you, Brett, thank you, Brett, thank you, Brett. Okay, that's what we call inflammation. I just put this slide in here because just recently, there's been some really fascinating stuff on Parkinson's. So Parkinson's is a brain disease, at least, and it's associated with shaking, very shaking, the stoop kind of look here, and usually onsets later in life. So Parkinson's is a brain disease. This field is just being turned on its head because they're now starting to realize it probably starts in the gut. So most of you probably drink coffee in the audience, right? Coffee's actually a preventative or decreases the incidence of Parkinson's. Probably because it keeps you motile, keeps you going in the morning, right? Constipation is a major risk factor associated with Parkinson's. But there's been some really interesting findings in this field. There's a nerve that hooks the brain to the gut. It's called the vagus nerve. And if you have these nasty, something called peptic dysbiotic ulcers, you're in a lot of pain. In Denmark, for many years, the cure was to cut that nerve. And what they showed that if you cut that nerve, you basically had a really decreased risk of getting Parkinson's. If you only partially cut the nerve or didn't cut the nerve, you had the normal rates. And people saw this study and thought, well, that's interesting, but what does it really mean? And kind of no one believed it, I guess. But just 2 weeks ago, I think, there's another study came out of Sweden where they did exactly the same thing, big numbers, found exactly the same thing. This vagotomy actually decreases Parkinson's. So now I was just talking to a neurologist yesterday or a couple of days ago. She says she actually has people come in. Can you cut my nerve, please? Don't do it. It does many other good things for you. So there's that. And then experimentally, there was just a really interesting paper that came out a couple of months ago where in a mouse model they showed of Parkinson's, they showed, yes, indeed, gut microbes affected it and antibiotics could change it and all the kinds of things you'd think. But the most stunning experiment is they took feces from people with Parkinson's and people without Parkinson's, put them in the mouse model. And if they put Parky feces into these mice, they exacerbated the Parkinson's symptoms way more than the control people. It's almost one of those too good to be true experiments. So the scientific world is waiting to reproduce this. But if that holds true, that's a stunning confirmation, really, that Parkinson's is probably a gut disease that manifests it later in life in the brain. So there's all sorts of interesting implications there. Okay, enough depressing stuff. Let's go back to kids. Kids are never depressing, right? So if you've been with me so far, I'm trying to convince you that these microbes actually play a role in how we normally develop. So let's spend the last little while just discussing how you actually raise your kids with your microbes. So the way I look at it is that you need a balance. You have to balance between the idea of hygienic practice. You don't want your kids dying of infections, right? That balance with exposure to the microbes you normally evolve with. And so it really is a balance. And most of what I'm going to say in the next few minutes are really figuring out how do you get that balance right. There is no data to say that infecting your kid makes them better, other than maybe preventing getting that infection again. But that doesn't actually make a healthy thing. So you want to avoid disease, but you also want to expose them to microbes. And I'm saying that we are suffering what I call a hygiene hangover. We've just gotten too clean. And all the microbes that we've evolved with over the centuries, we're just taking on the equation. And our body is basically looking for them because that's how we've always been raised. Think of how people lived 5,500 years ago compared to how we live now. Very, very different from a microbial point of view. So I think the answer is to how do we get the balance and how do we actually get this right. So let's start here. Congratulations, you're pregnant. So third trimester, you've been dieting all your life. You say, oh, darn it, I'm pregnant. I'm going to gain weight for once. Throw the diet out the window. I can gain weight. I'm pregnant, right? If you gain too much weight in your third trimester, which you more than what you should do, it turns out that your microbes go towards more of an obese type phenotype. And when that kid is born, that kid has a much higher chance of becoming obese, simply because the thin mother became obese in the third trimester kind of thing, passed along those obese microbes to the kid. That kid is at risk for obesity, even though the mother was thin. Okay, that's one example. We're finding many others about how microbes affect how the baby develops in utero. We know that the microbes in the mother's gut are making these molecules that seep up into the fetus and actually affect the programming of that fetus, how the brain develops, how the gut develops, how the organism develops, even though that kid isn't even born yet. So pregnant mothers, you got to look after your microbes. Okay, we already talked about this wonderful event being born. It's when the kid first gets exposed to microbes. And this is obviously a major event. And if you're born by cesarean section, the kid's microbes look more like the mother's skin than the mother's vagina and feces, which the kid normally gets. So you've probably heard there's now people that have to have a C-section for a medical reason. There's about 10% of women have to have this for the kid or the mother's sake. They actually do what's called a VMT, vaginal material transfer. You take a Q-tip, you swab up the vagina, and then you smear it all over the kid so that kid can then actually have the mother's vaginal microbes. Why do they want those microbes? Because those are the ones that are involved in breaking down breast milk, something called lactobacillus and bifidobacter, and they're actually critical for that kid for developing normally. The problem with that is that there's something called group B streptococcus, which some pregnant women have. If the kid gets it, it'll die. So there's a lot of discussion now. There's naturopaths that are doing this vaginal swab. They have to screen for group B strep, otherwise you could infect it. But we don't know if it's going to work or not. There's studies underway, but you can imagine where people are trying to think, okay, you have to have a C-section. How can I recolonize my child with the microbes that they've missed out on? Breastfeeding. You've always heard breast is best. We've always thought because the mother had antibodies to protect the kid. I always thought breast milk was sterile. We now know it's actually not. It's full of microbes that actually help the kid break down breast milk. The other thing about breast milk is that Homo sapiens actually can break down very few components of it. We rely on the microbes that we got from my mother and elsewhere to actually break down the breast milk. And then the microbes break it down, and then feed the kid from that energy. So you can imagine formula companies now wondering, well, how the heck can we put microbes into breast milk, for example, because formula up until now have just been nutrients and things. They now realize these kids need some microbes as well. Okay, little kid. We call it soother in Canada, binky. I'm sure you guys call it something else. Whatever you call it here, that little thing that when your kid's crying, you stick it in the mouth and shuts them up. What does the kid do? Spits it out, right? Great, so what do? You put it back in. Kid spits out again. It's a great game for the kid's point of view, right? So, okay, the soother's bouncing around the floor here. What do? You got two choices, right? You can go to the washroom, wash it off, come back, put it in the child, or you can stick it in your own mouth and just stick it back in the kid's mouth. So there's a study that shows that if you stick it in your own mouth and stick it back in the kid's mouth, you will decrease that kid's chances of asthma, obesity, and diabetes way more significantly than if you let it bounce around on the floor and then you go wash it off. So there you go. I just saved you 5 minutes. You don't have to go to the washroom. Just shovel it in the kid's mouth and shut up, kid, kind of thing, right? So on the other part of the slide is hand sanitizer. This is the bane of our existence. So, kills 99% of microbes, yes, but it kills good microbes as well as bad. And actually, the antimicrobial ingredients in hand sanitizer have been banned by the FDA because they don't do anything other than kill microbes. But there's no data to say that hand sanitizer does any good. And I mean, if you go to a playground, I was just one the other day, every diaper bag's got a bottle of Purell hanging from it, right? And, these kids get their hands washed when they go from the slide to the swing, come back, wash their hands, they'll go on the merry-go-round, yeah, I'll wash my hands. I was just on a flight from Vancouver to Houston, about 4.5-hour flight. There was a mother with about an 18-month-old kid sitting beside me. In that 4.5-hour flight, she washed that kid's hands with hand sanitizer 18 times. And that kid did not even get out of the seat, and I didn't spit him on her or anything, So I was trying. She didn't speak English, or I would have given her a big lecture. What are you doing? Because you don't need that. Soap and water before meals, post-bathroom, is all you need in terms of hand sanitizer. You don't want to sterilize your hands. That's just, they are coated in microbes. Leave them that way. Okay, here's a skill testing question. Kid in a Hoover, right? What do kids do with dirt? They're magnets for it, right? They're in the dirt all the time. I mean, I've never seen anyone have abilities to get dirty faster than a kid. Why are they doing that? If dirt was so bad for us, wouldn't we evolve not to do this? Last thing you want to do is get dirty, right? But kids are in there. And I'm convinced that that's basically part of the normal childhood. You want to experience all the microbes in the world you live in because they're going to help you be you. And so when you're 20 and you first see these microbes, you're not going to freak out. Oh yeah, I had that when I was a kid. That's just, whatever bacterium it is, that's just normal. So I think in our quest to, live this really ultra clean, bubble baby kind of sanitized world, we're actually not doing our kids a favor. I think we're doing them more harm. Okay, how else can you bring microbes into your life? Get a dog. If you have a dog in your house, you have a 20% less chance of getting asthma than if you don't have a dog. What does a dog do? It does two things. It goes outside, runs over everywhere, rolls on dirt, preferably if there's feces in it, right? Gets as muddy as it can, then it comes romping into the house, and it rolls all over the kid, and the kid rolls all over it, and they lick each other, and that's just normal childhood, right? We can do fecal samples of kids, and I can tell you where that kid has a dog in their house or not, just by the microbes in that kid's feces. That's how intimate we are with a dog. If you're a cat lover in the world, sorry, there's no effect either way. Cats kind of sit in a corner and go, up yours, I'm not going to do this. They're off in their own world. So there's no data either way with cats. They probably don't interface as intimately with the kids as the dog did. So finally, your mother says, eat your vegetables. They're good for you. Your mother should be saying, eat your vegetables. They're good for the microbes that are good for you. So when you eat diets such as this, fruits, nuts, legumes, and everything, most of that stuff in there, Homo sapiens can't break down. We don't have the ability, the enzymes to do it. We know we're filled with microbes that are good at doing this stuff. And they will break down all these things, and they will generate energy, and that will give you energy from that. If you eat a lot of white sugar and white flour, these are basically broken down. They're so broken down that they're digested really early up in the small intestine. They never make it to the microbes. And ironically, what that does is starve the microbes deeper down, and it also pushes you more towards an obese phenotype, so you stand a much higher chance of getting obesity as we eat these processed sugars and flours. So there's all sorts of studies saying, about nutrition. We now know that whenever you hear the word nutrition, you should also think microbes, because that's really what you're talking about. The stuff you eat, the fruits, vegetables, legumes, nuts, all these types of things, they're microbial food, and by having a healthy, diverse gut microbe, that actually prevents a lot of the problems we've been talking about in here. Okay, so if you followed me this far, I think you can see where we're going. We are in trouble in terms of our microbes. And so this is just, the average child gets 10 to 12 courses of antibiotics, which carpet bomb all microbes, good and bad, before it gets to school, at least in the US. That's bad from a microbe point of view. And this is an experiment we did. The different colors, each one of those bars is a mouse, and the colors represent different microbes on it. And we have an untreated mouse, and then one treated with streptomycin and another metronidazole, 2 antibiotics. You see differences in color, right? What that says is that each of these antibiotics has drastically changed the mouse's microbes. It does the same in people. So what we're learning is that each generation we get cleaner, we get less diverse as we live in these cities and things, and we are really veering away and getting away from the microbes that we've always had as a species. So instead of germs, I'm starting to think maybe these things are endangered species. What do you tell the person that lives on the 20th floor of a condominium who had to have a C-section because of medical reasons? She had mastitis, so she couldn't breastfeed, had to bottle feed. The daycare's next door. You can't have pets in the building. What's that kid's microbes hope? It's hoop, right? So I think we need to rethink this whole thing, these microbes. They're not all our enemies. Yeah, there's some nasties out there, but there's only about 100 microbes that actually cause diseases in people. And there's thousands of microbes living in and on us that happily live in on us, and they're actually good for us. So I don't have an answer for this, but I think that we got to think about this is because every generation we get cleaner and cleaner and cleaner. I mean, we can't biobank grandpa's poop, and come back later, or store yours now, and your grandkid's born. Congratulations! Here's a little frozen tube of good stuff here. This is back from 2017. This was a good year. We can't do that. So what are we going to do? And I don't know. I think we've got to the stage to realize these things are important, but what we do about it. So that there's even people that are biobanking going off to Africa and places like this, Papua New Guinea, and looking at the microbes they have, which are very, very different than the ones that we see living in London or Vancouver, where I'm from, etc. So it's an interesting question. I think we're just starting to tackle it, but we don't have good answers yet. And finally, let me finish up with vaccines. I have to say this just because my wife's a pediatric infectious disease doctor. Vaccines work. You can pick your diseases. Since the introduction of vaccines, these are magnificent. So vaccines don't really affect the microbes. What they do is they're just a tiny bit of molecules that basically stimulate your immune system so it's ready in case it sees that infectious agent. But this whole anti-vaccination stuff that's on the web, it's done terrible harm to kids because as a parent, I've told you all about the microbes, but I also have to tell you about the vaccines. And I believe in vaccines so much that every year during flu season, we have a shot party. So my wife brings home the flu vaccines. So we basically take a shot of tequila and a flu vaccine. You go 1 shot, 2 shot, and there we're vaccinated, right? You have to have a flu shot every year because flu changes every year. But so anyway, parents in the audience, I urge you, go where the science is. Vaccines really do amazing stuff. So that takes me to the last point I want to make, and this is a book that I wrote along with Claire Arrieta, who's a postdoc in my lab. And it's really a book that's all about everything I've said tonight, plus much more. Each chapter's got do's and don'ts in it. It's really how to realize that microbes play a role in your kid's life, and how do you actually optimize it to do it. And so it was really, everything in this book is based on science, but I didn't go through the details of the scientific experiments. It's written at a layperson level. So if you're at all interested, I know they're going to sell it afterwards. If you ever have to go to a baby shower, give them this. It'll be the best gift they'll ever get. I'll even sign one for you. So in closing, what I've hoped to do tonight is convince you that just because you can't see them doesn't mean they're not important. We're full of microbes. It's a really new area of science. It's only less than a decade old. It's just exploding in terms of these things you never even dreamt microbes could have a role in. And I think, stay tuned. We don't have all the answers, but I think we're going to see many, many answers in the very short future. Because like I say, you can change your microbes really quick. I tell my students, go to Ireland and drink about 5 Guinness beers a day for 2 days and see what happens. They love the experiment because it changes what comes out the other end, right? The answer's obvious. Just change your microbes. So just think about that. When you're thinking about health and things, think about your microbes too, because they're playing a major role in basically how we function as a being. So with that, thank you very much.